Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President and General Counsel and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. Thank you all for being here. And a special welcome to the folks joining us on C-SPAN. We are looking forward to a spirited debate this afternoon in our panel following opening remarks from Secretary Wilbur Ross. And I am pleased and privileged to introduce the 39th Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. As Secretary, he's the principal voice of business in the Trump administration, trying to ensure that U.S. businesses have the tools they need to create jobs and pursue economic opportunity. He served as Secretary since the beginning of the administration, February 2017. He's got limited time with us today, so I'm going to be very brief in my introduction so we can get right to his talk. And he'll be leaving at the conclusion of his talk, and then the panel will ensue. Secretary Ross, of course, is no stranger to commerce. With over a half-century of experience in investment banking and private equity, restructuring over $400 billion in assets across numerous industries, and serving as chairman or lead director of more than 100 companies in over 20 countries. He's also the only person elected to both the Private Equity Hall of Fame and the Turnabout Management Hall of Fame. We're very pleased to welcome him here today. Please join me in welcoming Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross.
Thank you, Dean, for that kind introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Trump administration's trade policy and how it fits into our long-term goals for the country. The Federalist Society has always advocated for informed debate and a commitment to our constitutional government. The overall goal of our administration fits perfectly within the Federalist Charter. Only by maintaining a strong and viable economy can Americans live freely under the rule of law with guaranteed individual liberties and a separation of powers. Today, thanks to policies focused on rebuilding American industry, American jobs, American communities, and American prosperity, we are turning the tide toward a far more prosperous and hopeful future. But you'd never know it by listening to liberal politicians hell-bent on impeaching the most successful president since Ronald Reagan, nor to the left-wing media's desperate efforts to frighten Americans into a recession. In fact, the U.S. has the strongest economy of any major economy in the world. Our unemployment rate of 3.5% is the lowest it's been since 1969. Since the election of President Trump, the United States has added 6.4 million new jobs, including 500,000 in the manufacturing sector alone, and 136,000 new jobs in the month of September itself. Income and wages are up. Poverty is at the lowest level in almost 2 decades. The number of Americans needing federal food assistance has fallen by more than 10 million, from 44.2 million in 2016 to 33.7 million this year. Retail sales up by 4.6% over the past 12 months. And interestingly, the U.S. Import Price Index fell by 2% over the past year, despite the fears that people had had about the impact of tariffs. And last Friday, the president announced Phase 1 agreement in principle with China. This would phase in 40 to 50 billion of agricultural purchases over a 2-year period, more than twice our prior annual peak sales. It would also address some of the issues regarding intellectual property. The remaining issues, the remaining structural issues, and their enforcement remain to be negotiated. In return, the U.S. has agreed not to raise tariffs from 25% to 30% on October 15th. And as a sign of good faith, the Chinese recently made substantial purchases of agriculture, especially soybeans and pork. I believe that China came to the negotiations mainly because we imposed substantial tariffs on them, but also because of the personal relationship between President Trump and President Xi. Now, they naturally retaliated to the tariffs we put on, but because they sell us more than 4 times as many goods as we sell them, a given amount of tariff action means that they will run out of bullets before we do. And also, their economy is only 60% the size of ours. Therefore, a given amount of tariff product hurts them far more than it hurts us. Fear of tariffs also caused the EU recently to agree to buy more ag products from us and to begin negotiations on other topics. And it is the reason why Japan agreed to buy more meat and why the Koreans renegotiated chorus. The tariffs are now having a direct impact on Chinese producers, and perhaps more importantly, are accelerating the hollowing out of China's supply chain. China already was suffering some manufacturing emigration because of rising costs. Companies have begun to move operations elsewhere, in Southeast Asia, to Africa, and to North America. That will be hard to stop. China's problems with Hong Kong also hinders its economy and may further accelerate an exodus of foreign producers. Last week, the Commerce Department added 28 Chinese governmental and commercial organizations to the entity list. That list restricts the export of items used to target Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. We have also responded to China's Belt and Road Initiative with our new Indo-Pacific strategy. Last week, I was in New Delhi, Bangalore, Singapore, Canberra, and Sydney to discuss with the prime ministers and other ministers of the 3 countries our engagement with them and with others in the Indo-Pacific region. In November, I'll be in Bangkok, Jakarta, Hanoi, and possibly other cities in the region. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested in 117 nations, and those nations account for 2/3 of the world's population. Their state-owned enterprises use Chinese materials and Chinese nationals to build projects, very little local content. And if defaults occur, they foreclose on the assets rather than renegotiating the loans. For example, in Sri Lanka, China has already foreclosed the Chinese-built port in Hambantota. It has also taken control of natural resources, such as cobalt mining in the Congo and hydrocarbons in Venezuela. Belt and Road is also effectively a jobs program for China that eases some of the impact of tariffs on their domestic employment. By electing President Trump in 2016, the American people instead demanded free, fair, and reciprocal trade. The Section 232 tariffs imposed by the Department of Commerce are part of that strategy. Prior to the imposition of the 232 tariffs in March of 2018, both the U.S. aluminum and steel industries were on the verge of collapsing. Now, utilization rates have improved noticeably, and $13 billion of vital expenditures have been committed to expanded and modernized capacity, including $1.3 billion from an Indian steel company. Now that our corporate tax system and regulatory environment are so business-friendly, foreign companies are more eager than ever before to invest in our market. We have the largest foreign direct investment stock of any nation, totaling $4.3 trillion. To foster rapid growth in FDI, I and other commerce executives constantly speak to business leaders around the world. And every June, we host the Select USA Conference here in Washington, a 3-day summit promoting foreign direct investment. Last year, this event attracted 3,100 participants. We have also created a Reselect USA initiative to encourage American companies to reselect the United States as their domestic and export manufacturing hub. And last but not least, the Trump administration aggressively pursues bilateral trade deals. We have signed an initial trade agreement with Japan that opens that market to U.S. farmers and should generate $7 billion in sales. That's about 40% of the agricultural trade that we lost to Chinese retaliations. The Japanese Trade Pact also will facilitate $40 billion in bilateral trade between the U.S. and Japan in digital services. This is close to 90% of what we would have achieved from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, yet without the harmful TPP concessions that the U.S. would have made to other countries besides Japan. And this is the third major trade deal announced by President Trump in less than 3 years, a remarkable achievement since trade agreements normally take many years, often more than a decade, to execute. For the record, the other two agreements are the Korea Free Trade Agreement and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is pending congressional approval. Let me conclude by talking about the situation in Turkey. Yesterday, President Trump announced 2 actions against Turkey that involve the Department of Commerce. We're raising their steel tariffs back up to 50% from the current level of 25%. Turkey is the 8th largest steel producer in the world, and steel was about its largest export to the United States before the tariffs. Its exports of steel to the U.S. surged 303% from 10,000 metric tons per month to 42,000 per month when we dropped the tariffs originally back to the 25%. The President also directed the department to cease work on the plan we had been developing with the Turkish government to expand our bilateral trade from the current 20 billion annual total to 100 billion over the next few years. Already, 1,700 U.S. businesses operate in Turkey, and in September, I had traveled to Istanbul and Ankara, vetting the detailed plan with leading Turkish businesses and government officials. The three major business associations there all endorsed it, and one of them hosted a large celebratory dinner at Cipriani on 42nd Street in New York City during the UN General Assembly week in September. If achieved, the plan would increase Turkish GDP by 4% and provide more than 150,000 direct jobs. The plan was always contingent on resolving the military differences between our two countries. These now include the excursion into Syria. It would be an excellent time for Turkey to break into global supply chains in a big way, as many companies are reassessing their earlier decisions to concentrate so much on China. But there will be a cost to the Turkish economy if present military practices continue. Turkey will bear the costs of the war and forego the potential trade benefits. In conclusion, the Trump administration is focusing more intently on trade than any prior administration. There are some short-term costs associated with this shift, but there are much greater long-term potential and probable gains. Millions of Americans have demanded that we put their interests first. That is what we are doing, and that is what we will continue to do. Thank you, and I appreciate the Federalist Society's discussions about these issues. They are critical to the health and preservation of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. If we could call the panelists forward, we'll move on to the next phase of our program. And to set the table. So thank you so much, Secretary Ross, for joining us today. We're going to begin our panel. We're going to hear opening remarks from each of our panelists in turn, moving right down the lane here, and I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. Each will have about 5 to 8 minutes, strictly enforced, for their opening remarks, and then we'll have some discussion and ultimately questions from the audience, so do have those in mind for when we get to that portion of the program. Ron Cass is our first speaker. He's Dean Emeritus at Boston University School of Law. He's also the former Vice Chairman and Commissioner of the U.S. International Trade Commission. He is currently the Chairman of the Center for the Rule of Law and President of Cass and Associates. There he is an arbitrator or mediator for commercial, international, and intellectual property rights disputes. He also, I think, interestingly, has been appointed 6 times, 6 presidential appointments spanning Presidents Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, which I secretly think was a ploy for him to justify getting a bigger office with wall space to hang all those commissions. We'll hear next from Donald Cameron. He's a partner in the Morris, Manning, and Martin law firm right here in town with an international trade practice. He's got over 3 decades of experience representing multinational businesses, foreign governments, foreign trade associations, and U.S. importers. He's got particular experience defending clients in industry sectors that are politically sensitive, so we're welcome him today. And lastly, we'll hear from Jeffrey Kessler. He was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate on April 3rd, 2019, so he's been with the Secretary for quite a while. He serves as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Enforcement and Compliance with the goal of promoting U.S. jobs and economic growth. Prior to serving at Commerce, he was an international trade attorney in private practice, litigating several precedent-setting World Trade Organization cases, among other things. With that, 5 to 8 minutes for each of you. Dean Cass.
Thank you very much, Dean. I actually thought we were here today to talk about your best-selling book. Dean has recently published a book. I'm envious. My books are what my wife calls academic books. She says once you've put them down, you just can't pick them back up again. I urge you to look at Dean's book instead. I'm going to start first with a small story from the pre-GPS age about the great American philosopher Yogi Berra. Mr. Berra was in his apartment in New York, not at Cipriani, and was cooking and started a grease fire in his kitchen. He called the fire department, told them that he had a grease fire in his kitchen. He needed them to come put it out. The person taking the call at the fire station said, we'll be there as soon as we can, Mr. Berra, but can you tell us how to get there? Yogi's response was, what happened to those little red trucks you used to have? There are times when there are certain things that are quite obvious, but not always obvious to everyone else. I am a proponent of open trade. Trade is a source of competition. Competition is generally good. Obviously, it's not good for everyone. It's not good for somebody who is competing with me, or not good for me to have extra competition. But competition generally promotes getting more things to more people at better prices and with better quality. Having an opportunity to have trade and trade on terms that open economies one to another is generally something to be supported. But competition takes place in other spheres as well. And one sphere that I am particularly focused on is the national security sphere. We are competing with other players in the world, not just to get our products into their country and to get the products we want from their countries. We are also competing on various military and security dimensions. And in that regard, I want to say that I regard everything that is being done by the administration as generally supporting trade, but with a special focus on China. And I think that focus is appropriate because China has special interests in the national security sphere that we must be aware of. China has a lot of state-run parts of its economy. It is opening the economy more. It is allowing more free enterprise, but it has also maintained a lot of state control through both investment and personnel. There are more than 150,000 state-owned enterprises in China and many other enterprises in China that have state investment and state control, both direct and indirect, of those enterprises. We have to be aware that this affects a lot of products that come into the U.S., particularly in the information and communications technology sector. There is a lot of discussion in the United States about Huawei and Zte as potential threats to American national security. The problem is actually much broader than that. A lot of products from companies that we all know and many of us have purchased from, including GoPro and Lenovo and Lexmark and many other Chinese brands, are products that have been found to have backdoors in their software or flaws in their construction that allow security threats to be maintained and to have Chinese espionage and cyber espionage elements make use of those opportunities. Those are things that I believe the department should look at through the Section 232 process, which is a process that allows us to take considerations of national security into account when we are making our decisions on what imports are appropriate into the United States. The great majority of products are products that are outside this space. They're products that involve the sort of technologies that are relatively easily evaluated. A lot of complex products, a lot of us carry around cell phones that have computing power far greater than the first large-scale computers had, than the computers had that we sent people to the moon with. We carry those around. Those are very highly complex, technologically dense devices, hard for any of us to know what's in there. The same is true of the computers we use, which now most of us have notebooks or laptops or other computing devices that we do almost all our work on. Again, hard to know what's in there, hard to make sure that we are protected from a security standpoint. My wife and I were in a hotel room recently having a conversation, and a voice, not hers or mine, started responding to us, asking us things. We hadn't realized that there was one of those, I think it was an Alexa device in the room that was turned on. We don't know what sort of information is going out in a lot of the communications we're doing, as well as not knowing what comes in. That aside, and again, I think that's something to be taken very seriously and something on which China is different than other players in the world. That aside, I'm very supportive of initiatives to expand trade, to facilitate trade on open, competitive grounds, and look forward to further discussions on both the trade, economic, and security fronts.
Thank you,
Don. Is this working? Okay, sorry. Thanks, Dean. The discussion used to be free but fair trade, which supplied the logic behind extensive use of the expansion of unfair trade laws, primarily anti-dumping countervailing duty laws. Whether that trade is indeed unfair is a separate discussion. But what we have now is not fair trade. It's managed trade, and as long as we all understand that, then that's fine. But it's managed trade to an extent that we haven't had really since Smoot-Hawley. And it's not necessarily being managed particularly well. The other casualty of the trade policies of the administration has been rules-based trade. The United States has taken unilateral action that led predictably to retaliation. The GATT-WTO was constructed to eliminate, to the extent possible, unilateral actions, which are the antithesis of rules-based trade. Now, the decision has apparently been made that the rules-based system, constructed largely by the United States out of the ashes of World War II, no longer work, or they no longer work for the United States. And I question that conclusion. We had 7 years of recovery coming into 2016, strongest economy in the world. We're now seeing a slowing of the economy, but that's not particularly surprising since we are now at the 10 years into the recovery. The abandonment of a rules-based system, though, leads to unpredictability, and unpredictability translates into many things, including less foreign investment. And if you talk to businesses out there, predictability is something that they seek. This is the way they base their business. According to the Wall Street Journal, a majority of economists currently believe that the manufacturing sector is in a recession. One reason given, unfair trade practices. The agriculture sector has been severely hurt by these trade policies. Soybean exports have been decimated, And, you know, the farmers have been the first ones hit by the 232 retaliation. With respect to steel, there are approximately $900,000 per job created. There's like an 80-to-1 disparity between steel worker jobs and steel consuming jobs. And the 80 is the steel consuming jobs. So let's just talk for 1 minute about 232. So the 232 on imports of steel was the first action by the Secretary determining that imports of steel threatened national security of the United States. As a result, the President imposed 25% tariffs on most suppliers and quotas on others. The Secretary of Defense, who had to be consulted under the law, specifically informed the Secretary of Commerce that imports were not a threat to the national defense. That had no impact on the decision. In 2001, then President Bush investigated the same issue and concluded within 1 month of following 9/11 that imports of steel were not a threat to national security. Now, you might want to ask why the administration chose this route rather than, for instance, a safeguard investigation under Section 201, which President Bush also did in 2001. In that case, the ITC made an affirmative determination in 16 out of 33 product categories, leading to tariffs of varying degrees for those products. By the way, there was no retaliation for those actions. But the administration, and this is a guess because I don't know the answer to this, the administration, I think, did not want to chance the possibility of negative determinations in some or all product categories. But I would point out that primarily because of the impact of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, which, by the way, was said to be not having any impact on imports of steel, well, between 2014 and 2016, apparent consumption of steel declined by 16.2%. During that same period, total steel imports declined by 25.5%, from 44 million to 33 million tons. And as a result, imports as a percentage of apparent consumption declined from 31 to 27%. The justification for the 232 was Chinese overcapacity. So instead of targeting imports from China, which would have had little impact on the steel industry since its imports had largely been cut off, steel imports had been cut off by AD/CVD decisions, we imposed 232 on everybody else, including China. One result of Section 232 was countries, beginning with China, retaliated against United States agriculture. The irony of all this is that of all of the countries that were subject to 232 restrictions, China had the least stake. Other countries such as the EU, Canada, and Mexico retaliated. Canada and Mexico are no longer there because of the impact of the USMCA agreement. And as a result they lifted their retaliation. But the reason is that it's self-evident. You know, why is it that they would import? Why would people retaliate immediately? I mean, why not wait? They didn't retaliate in Section 201. But the reason is pretty self-evident because these were actions, unilateral, taken under the guise of national security, and claimed to be that they were conforming to the national security exception in Article 21 of the GATT. Well, if you look at Article 21 of the GATT, you'll see that these don't meet those criteria at all. The U.S. is still threatening to impose 232 restrictions on automobiles. So, on behalf of the American Iron and Steel Institute, the American Institute for Imported Steel, AIIS, we are working together with Professor Alan Morrison, who was actually supposed to be giving this speech, by the way. And we filed a constitutional challenge to Section 232, alleging that it constitutes an unlawful delegation of legislative functions to the executive branch. There are no boundaries or definitions of national security, nor limits on what actions can be taken against imports. And that appeal is now pending before the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Subsequent to the 232, the United States also imposed tariffs on imports of China, which has led to retaliation. There's apparently another ceasefire that was referenced by the Secretary. But we've seen ceasefires in the past that have fallen through, so we're gonna have to see exactly what happens. And we'll talk some more in the question and answer. I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Okay. I'll respond to those comments, but let me first fill in some details about what the Trump administration is doing in trade policy, what the administration is doing to pursue free, fair, and reciprocal trade. I think one thing that's come across in the comments we've heard this morning is that the administration is using new tools to a greater extent than prior administrations. 232 would be one of them, but there are others as well. And there's a reason for the administration's increased willingness to turn to tools that some consider unconventional. When the administration took office in early 2017, the United States had been suffering from a series of trade policy challenges that were getting worse over time, not better. And the administration came into office with a mandate to address them and to be more proactive than prior administrations in addressing them. And that is what the administration has done. For example, there is the China challenge, and I agree with Professor Cass that that's a huge challenge for the United States. Over many years, China had systematically pursued discriminatory trade and investment policies that put U.S. companies and workers at a disadvantage. The theft of intellectual property, cyber intrusions, forced technology transfer, industrial subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and as well as some of the specific problems that Professor Cass mentioned. A study in 2016 by some MIT economists and others showed that import competition from China had led to the loss of more than 2 million jobs from 1999 to 2011. And it also showed that it had contributed to the erosion of the American manufacturing base. So this is a significant challenge for the United States, and one that the traditional tools of trade policy had failed to resolve. Structured dialogues with China and one-off WTO disputes did not prevent the problem from intensifying in the years before the president took office. Another problem that had been getting worse was the global crisis in excess steel and aluminum capacity. For example, from 2000 to 2016, global capacity in steel increased by 127%. As of 2016, China had so much excess capacity to produce steel that its excess capacity dwarfed the entire production of steel of the United States. And the situation was similar for aluminum. So, these were serious problems. The traditional tools failed to meet them, and the administration decided to take a different course. The administration, for example, with respect to China, the administration imposed tariffs under Section 301 starting in July 2018. And those tariffs certainly have put pressure on China, and as the deal announced last week shows, they're starting to work. They're starting to bear fruit in a way that the approach of previous administrations hadn't. And Section 301, using Section 301 in this way hadn't been done since the 1990s. The Section 301 actually had its heyday under President Reagan, but it is proving effective. Another example is the Section 232 tariffs that Don mentioned. The Section 232 is a tool that hadn't been used also since President Reagan, but the administration decided to impose these tariffs to stem the global crisis in excess capacity and prevent excess capacity from reaching American shores. It's true that it affected all countries and not just China, and it's true that China was the main driver of the excess capacity. But this was a global problem and merited a global solution. Another example is the Section 201 tariffs that President Trump announced in January 2018 on solar cells and modules and washing machines. These are industry specific, but these tariffs also addressed a serious problem of an import surge in these particular sectors. And Section 201 hadn't been used since President George W. Bush. Just to be clear also, the administration is doing much more than tariffs, and the Secretary discussed that in his remarks. The administration also has negotiated a new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which once Congress ratifies it should generate $68 billion annually in economic activity and 175,000 jobs. The administration also negotiated a new deal with Japan and renegotiated the existing agreement with Korea, and has expressed interest in a possible new agreement with the United Kingdom. So the administration is pursuing a free trade agenda. And I would also add that the administration is working with allies and partners and multilateral fora to advance free, fair, and reciprocal trade. For example, there's been a series of trilateral dialogues between the United States, Japan, and the European Union about reforming the World Trade Organization, which I think there's a bipartisan consensus. I think that the WTO is very much in need of reform, and many outside the United States acknowledge that as well. In addition, the administration has been a leader in the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity to address that problem. The administration has spearheaded e-commerce, plurilateral negotiations at the World Trade Organization. So the administration is working with partners and allies to address these problems, but we are not shying away from bold action, even when some of our partners and allies are involved. So overall, the administration is making trade policy in a way that's a reasonable response to the world as it stood in 2016. Again, the traditional tools hadn't been working. Something new was needed, and the administration isn't flinching from trying new policy approaches. Let me address a few of the other comments that I heard, if I have time.
Just a couple minutes.
Okay. First, as to the charge that the United States is now somehow a country that uses managed trade rather than free trade. I think what I would say is in the Heritage Foundation's 2019 Index of Economic Freedom, the United States was 12th. The United States was one of the most highly ranked countries in the world. So I think we still have a pretty good system of free trade. We have tariffs on a lot of on some imports, but it only represents a small proportion of total U.S. imports. So under $400 billion that are affected by tariffs in the context of a more than $20 trillion economy. I also want to address the reference to Smoot-Hawley, which I think is an exaggeration, a big exaggeration. Smoot-Hawley, the problem with Smoot-Hawley was that it reduced U.S. exports from 1931 to 1933 by 60% as a result of retaliatory tariffs. By contrast, exports are going up today. Exports went up from 2016 to 2017, 2017 to 2018, and in 2019, year to date, they're on track to be the same as 2018. So I don't see that as an apt historical comparison. Often Smoot-Hawley is invoked as a way of just charging that any use of tariffs is bad. Any use of tariffs is bad. I think the administration views tariffs more neutrally. Tariffs are a policy instrument that can be used to achieve different objectives, economic objectives, geopolitical objectives, and so on. And whether tariffs are appropriate in a particular case should be evaluated on that basis. One other thing that I want to address is why, there was a question of why the United States used Section 232 rather than another tool to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum. And I would just say it's a neat fit with the statute. I wrote down some of the statute. I'm not sure I can read my own writing, but the statute says that the Secretary and the President shall further recognize the close relation of the economic welfare of the nation to our nation's security, and shall take into consideration the impact of foreign competition on the economic welfare of individual domestic industries. And it goes on to talk about employment, loss of skills or investment. Section 232 is just a neat fit for the situation that the steel and aluminum industries found themselves in. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I noticed that Don was scribbling furiously while you were speaking, and Ron took a few notes himself, so I want to give folks a chance to respond. I can't get this other microphone to work, so Ron and I are going to share a microphone, but let me turn to you, Ron, first. Just take 2 or 3 minutes and respond.
Thank you, and appreciations to both panelists. First of all, I do think that by and large it is positive to look at trade overall rather than respect to one country. I try not to look at bilateral trade issues unless I really have to. I have a terrible bilateral trade problem with my grocery store. I keep giving them money and all they give me are groceries. So a lot of these issues are ones that are better looked at in terms of how all the countries we deal with operate. I also think it is worthwhile looking at trade and tariffs in connection with how they work at trade opening. A lot of times putting tariffs on a product is a strategic decision in order to try to get more open trade rather than simply to close trade, although there are many industries that like tariffs because it inhibits competition. And I think you have to look at what any administration is doing, not just on the question of whether it has tariffs going up or down at a particular moment, but whether the use of tariffs is intended to and effective at getting more trade opening broadly with respect to other nations. I also think it's important, and Jeff emphasized this, when we are working with respect to what we're going to do on the trade front, to be working with other nations. And Jeff emphasized that we are working with trade partners on different initiatives. A lot of people will criticize any administration if it doesn't sign a trade deal that a particular set of people like. Not every trade deal is a good deal, and not every trade deal opens trade. We have negotiated some trade deals that run to 800 or 900 pages. It doesn't take 800 or 900 pages to say we want to have open trade, which again is not to say that even a long trade deal can't be good, but we should recognize that our trade negotiations aren't uniformly going in one direction under any sort of negotiations. One thing I wanted to pick up in Don's remarks, he talks about the intersection of GATT Article 21 and the 232 process here. And there is a serious interpretive question as to whether and to what degree a U.S. domestic law should be interpreted by looking at a collateral trade agreement that deals with the same issues. The GATT Article 21 safeguards provision will determine the degree to which a U.S. action is viewed as consistent or inconsistent with our international agreements. That's a separate question than the question that a court or an administration faces in interpreting the law, the U.S. law, that is on the books and directs the administration in how to act and directs the courts in what is legitimate under U.S. law. And that was a point that Nino Scalia often made to others who wanted him to look at international agreements when he was interpreting U.S. law. Last point, when I was talking earlier about the threat from China on the national security front, I think many people can make decisions that protect themselves in their economic purchases. None of us is very effective at making decisions that protect us from a national security standpoint. I can't tell whether something I'm doing is helping the national security or not, and my own individual action is not going to be terribly determinative in terms of national security. That is something we do need the government to look at and the government to take actions based on. I have a paper on China, Chinese exports and national security that will be published on the Federalist Society website. It is, unlike Dean's book on the hidden Nazi, it is one of those reads that my wife would encourage people to really focus on when you are tired and having difficulty falling asleep.
I should have mentioned in my introduction of Ron, he's also my literary agent. So, Don, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to respond,
Sure.
and we'll move on from there.
First, I would like to address the article, GATT Article 21. I actually agree with Ron on that. The reason that I pointed to GATT Article 21 was not to say that that was germane to whether or not there was some illegal, something wrong with respect to the domestic law. GATT Article 21 was pointed to specifically because the question arises, why would people unilaterally retaliate? And the answer to that question is because the measures that were taken by the United States did not conform to GATT Article 21. They're not even close. So I agree. With respect to whether or not the U.S. law is or is not a good thing, that's the reason that we have a constitutional challenge that is pending before the courts. This is not an action against the actions of the administration. It is an action against the law itself, which was passed in 1962. The provisions itself, if you look at it, basically say that in order to define it, you can, first of all, the Secretary should give consideration to domestic production needed for national defense requirements, which of course the Secretary of Defense said everything was okay. But the section D is so broad that it says at the end that there's a number of factors, and Jeff reeled off a number of the language, and then it says, without excluding other factors. In other words, anything can be used to make a decision here. And the point that we have made in our constitutional challenge is that indeed there are no standards and there are no limitations. And that actually is an illegal delegation, unconstitutional delegation of legislative powers to the executive branch. And that's the difference between that and, for instance, Section 201. Section 201, the ITC makes determinations. Injury, no injury. There are limitations on what the president can do in order to restrict imports. Just for 1 second, with respect to managed trade, if you don't think there's managed trade, then you are not a farmer and you are not a steel consumer, because if you are one of those two things, you can understand there is managed trade. There are choices that are being made. Now, managed trade I don't find that to be particularly offensive. There's managed trade all the time. But in this room, I think managed trade takes on a different context maybe than in other fora. But I would tell you that it is heavily managed, and that is really, as long as everybody is upfront about the fact that, sure, we're picking winners and losers. You've got an exclusion process at the Commerce Department for granting exclusions to the 232 tariffs. Well, it's a very cumbersome process, and it's a very difficult process to wend your way through. That's a fact, and the fact that steel consumers are having to do that, that's one outgrowth of managed trade. They have an enormous number of people that are in charge of trying to administer this process. They work extremely hard, but they're also not steel experts, and nor can they be. And so the system works about as well as you would think that it works, and it doesn't work particularly well. Finally, with respect to Smoot-Hawley, again, it was kind of an example. I think that Jeff may be right that that's going too far. But then again, the economy these days is not as dependent upon manufacturing as it was in 1928. And I would say to you that if you are a farmer or in the agricultural sector these days, those differences between now and Smoot-Hawley, I'm not sure how different they are. So,
Thank you. Before you surrender the mic, can you give us the case name on that non-delegation challenge?
sure.
We'll come back to you for that. Jeff, I think you probably want to take a couple minutes and elaborate.
Sure.
Respond.
Well, I won't comment on the pending litigation. With respect to the GATT issue, all I have to say is that the United States believes all of its actions, including the actions under 232, are fully consistent with WTO rules. And, on 232, I disagree with your characterization of managed trade and of the way that the exclusion process works. We're proud of the way that the exclusion process is working. We've processed many exclusions. The process is based on objective criteria. And, so I disagree.
Terrific. We're going to start taking questions from the audience. If you have a question, there are floor mics. If you go to one of the floor microphones to ask your question. And while we're waiting, please go to the floor mic if you have a question. We will, the program says we're going to go till 2:30, but we agreed as we were eating lunch, we'll try to wrap up by 2 o'clock because we think it's important that the panel finish before the audience does.
Plus, we didn't eat dessert yet.
Right. With that, we want brief questions that end in a question mark rather than statements, so please be clear and as crisp as possible. Before we turn to the audience, I just want to ask a question of all three panelists. I'm certainly no expert in this area, and I'm just wondering to what extent, if at all, should the United States take into consideration in setting trade policy the form of government of the country with which it's dealing. And here I'm thinking about some of the national security issues that Ron raised, but also some of the economic issues. If we're dealing with a country that has state-owned or state-supported enterprises, how do you do the math on those, and how do you figure out what free trade is? And then how also do you take into consideration the national security implications?
Well, as a general rule, I think it is better to look at the economic flows and trying to open up economic flows rather than looking at factors in any country that lead to the production of the goods. We do have certain rules, both internationally and domestically, that allow us to look at state subsidies and the degree to which the subsidies are intended to and do in fact distort trade flows. And those are processes that go through the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission. Those are subject to the laws on countervailing duties and also to some degree are embedded in the anti-dumping regulations. I think it is a different matter, though, when we talk about security. If you have a country that has an authoritarian government that has very consciously used its authority domestically to regulate aspects of the economy that have an impact on national security, to facilitate espionage efforts and cyber espionage efforts. When you have control that affects the way products are produced and marketed in a particular country, that has an impact on what you should be doing from a national security standpoint. And I would draw a distinction between that and the usual matter of dealing with economic flows. We do have provisions in both the international agreements and our domestic law that allow us to use different sorts of computations when we are trying to figure things out in cases involving dumping from non-market economies. Those, however, are a different question from looking at the structure of government itself, which I think you were asking about.
Right. Don, let me give you a chance to speak up on this.
I generally agree with what Ron said, although I must say that I don't agree that the NME doesn't go to the structure of government. the NME rules, which, look, anti-dumping and the theory of anti-dumping, to the extent that any of you are into the interstices of trade policy and trade law, long ago left the intellectual mooring of something one would call real policy. Anti-dumping is a way to assess a tax on your foreign competition. And that's fair enough. That's what the rules are. That's what the international rules that we've agreed to are, and that's what the U.S. does. But that's what it is. When you get down to the unfairness element, that's a pejorative term that is useful in political discussion, but doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. With respect to NME methodology, that is so far afield from anything that one would call intellectually honest that it's really you can't. That has nothing to do with anything aside from we can put more penalties on. Let me just give you one example. Commerce Department determined a few years ago that it would be a good idea and would be legitimate to bring countervailing duty cases against companies in China. Why? Because prior to that, they decided, well, it's all government-run enterprise anyway, and so everything is 100% owned and run by the government. So we're going to just do NME methodology, by which what we do is we create a surrogate value and surrogate benchmarks in which to compare the prices of the United States. This is why you get dumping margins of 200% and higher many times in these cases. Well, the Commerce Department looked at this and said, well, we have determined that I believe it was 87%, I don't remember the precise number, but 87% of the economics in China actually is not state-run, it's not state-controlled, and therefore it is legitimate for us to do countervailing duty cases against China. Fair enough, okay, so you're going to now measure subsidies in China. Well, if you're going to measure subsidies in China, that of course would mean that you're not going to follow a non-market economy anti-dumping methodology, right? Because, I mean, if you're going to do a subsidy case and then you're going to treat the dumping as a market economy, right? No, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep the non-market economy methodology, and we're going to do the subsidies so we can get those 200% dumping and countervailing duty margins up to 300%. I mean, okay, I get it. It's a matter of how high do you want the tax, but it has to do with the form of government.
And did you dig out that case name?
It's AIAS, American Institute for Imported Steel versus the United States. It's pending at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. There's also a Court of International Trade case there, and I'll send you the court number.
Great. Jeff, let me give you a chance to weigh in there, and then we're going to go to the audience questions.
Sure. Thank you. Well, on the last point that Mr. Cameron made, I think his concern is with Congress and the way that Congress set up the laws.
Right.
Congress actually changed the laws to permit commerce to both impose countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties at the same time. Commerce applies the law rigorously as Congress enacted it. Congress decided what's unfair trade, and Commerce applies that in various cases faithfully. You know, we have a process at Commerce that is subject to judicial review, and that means if we ever depart from the statute, there may well be a consequence in the form of a court case that appeals our determination. So, you know, again, all of our determinations are rigorous, they adhere to the statute, and, you know, we administer the law the way that Congress enacted it. On the other topic, your original question about whether the form of government is important, the answer is absolutely. You know, the United States experience with China shows this. It is largely due to the non-market-based practices of China and the non-market structure of China's economy that the United States has encountered so many problems with China, the ones that I mentioned that have been intensifying in recent years. And it's largely in recognition of the special challenges posed by non-market-based economies that the United States, Japan, and the European Union are having this trilateral discussion about reforming WTO rules. The discussions are focused on topics like industrial subsidies to state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer, and other non-market-based practices. So this is, the form of government of countries is absolutely critical. The model of progressive liberalization that the United States pursued after World War II of gradual reductions in tariffs, that's extremely valuable, extremely important, but when it comes to an economy like China's, it's insufficient to break down the trade and investment barriers that pose a threat to U.S. companies and workers.
All right, let's move to the audience now, and remember, please, a question rather than a statement. I think you might have been first to the microphone. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Simone Gao with Zooming In at NTD TV. This question is for Mr. Kessler. I want your assessment of ultimately, do you think China will make those structural changes that demands, basically the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to change the way they run their economy, to change the way they run their country, and basically to change the way they rule. And isn't that something that just they fundamentally couldn't do? That's the first question. Second question, regarding Hong Kong. If Hong Kong situations largely stay the same with no Tiananmen-style massacre, but with continued demonstration and more those so-called suicides, would the U.S., would the Trump administration support the revoke of the Hong Kong special trade status? Thank you.
Okay. On the first question, I think that it is possible that China will make structural changes. It certainly has made structural changes to its economy in the past, dramatic ones, and it's within its capacity to make further structural changes and to pursue more reform and opening up. Unfortunately, China, has not adhered to reform and opening up in recent years, but I do believe that it's possible to return to that path. I don't have a comment on the Hong Kong situation.
The question was for Jeff, but let me give our other panelists a chance to respond if they'd like to.
I would say that even though a lot of the changes that would make trade more similar with China to trade with other market-based economies, the United States has not refused to trade with countries that have authoritarian governments, nor has it refused to trade with countries that have non-market-based economies. That's a different question from the question how some of the rules operate, and that was what Don was talking about earlier, and it's a different question from what sort of trade agreements are mutually advantageous to the United States and other countries.
Question on this side.
Yeah, hi. My name is Elaine Middleman. I'm an attorney. I have a background in the auto industry. I just wondered, with the General Motors strike and the pressure on the companies to keep plants open in the United States, the uncertainty with autonomous vehicles, I just wonder what you thought about how that's going to impact the trade issues.
Go ahead, Don.
Well, I mean, the GM strike is obviously problematic. For instance, you had a closing at Lordstown. You are in the auto industry, you know Lordstown. I grew up in Cleveland. I know Lordstown too. Lordstown has had issues for over 20 years. But the other issue that Lordstown faced, which was rather new to the party, was that Lordstown makes small cars, right? And steel costs increased by over 25% because the 25% tariff didn't just affect the price of imports, right? It affected the price of steel. That the price of steel sheet has been coming down recently, but that is the reality. So they were also caught in a cost-price squeeze. Now, the administration denied that steel tariffs had anything to do with the shutting of Lordstown. I'd say that's a tough thing to say because there was no way they were going to be able to make a profit once those prices went up. But strikes are problematic. But strikes happen regardless of who's in power and what the trade policies are. But they are going to exert more pressure, just as the pressure from the ag community. The pressure from the ag community is real. Why? Because many of those people are going bankrupt, and they're going bankrupt specifically because of the trade policies of this administration.
Jeff or Ron on this point?
I mean, I guess it's just a reminder that many Americans continue to experience economic anxiety. And, it's a reminder for the administration that we have a responsibility to do something about it.
Ron?
The sort of economic dislocations you're talking about affect how people feel about not only their own circumstances, but the U.S. economy and trade that has an impact on their own lives, their own sort of production. A lot of people look at trade through the lens of what that does for competition with what I produce, even though they would then go to the store and try to find things from other markets that fit their purchasing needs. It has less to do with the sort of trade policy that we ought to be following and more to do with the way people will feel about it.
Another question from the audience this side.
Thank you. Kat Lucero with MLEX, reporter for MLEX. This question is for Mr. Kessler. You talked about Section 232. Mr. Ross talked about the Turkey sanctions. So my question is, how is the administration justifying raising the tariff to 50% on steel imports from Turkey under Section 232, or will it be under a different authority?
I'm not going to comment on that right now. I think details of that policy action are forthcoming.
Another question on this side.
Yes. For the gentleman whose first name is Don. So I'm not an expert in this area. In the investment business, however, I do know that a lot of apparent disagreements can be understood by contrasting someone who's looking at an issue from the short term or from the long term. And I don't know what constraints are on the Secretary of Defense when he's asked to make a determination as to whether or not a certain situation is problematic from the standpoint of defense. But I would guess would be a relatively short-term point of view that he's taking as we look at the situation right now. Is there sufficient steel, there's sufficient input to the defense industrial base from allies that are available to the United States? One could make a prudential call for the long term that looks more about in terms of how could one recover an industry that had closed or ceased to exist because of trade differentials, thereby simply by looking at the extended time view justifying a different prudential view. Does that make any difference to your analysis?
Thanks. No, it doesn't. The Secretary of Defense basically made the same analysis recently that he did in 2001. It was a different secretary. Basically, what they found was that the needs of the steel, the current production of the steel industry, dwarfed the needs of the defense industry, and he doesn't look at it as short term because that's the whole point of the national security analysis. I would also say that the rumors of the demise of the steel industry are greatly exaggerated. The steel industry in this country is the most protected industry historically ever. It's even more protected than the textile industry was. We have had protection for the United States steel industry since 1974. You had the VRAs, you then had the trigger price mechanism, you then had VRAs again, you then had anti-dumping countervailing duties. That was followed by the escape clause. That was followed by more anti-dumping countervailing duties. It is not a coincidence that between 2014 and 2016, imports of steel fell. They fell specifically in response to the fact that anti-dumping and CVDs actually worked and limited imports of steel. You talk about the demise of the steel industry. At the same time that they were starting to do 232, Big River was investing in a greenfield plant of 3 million tons down in Texas. There's an additional 6 million tons coming on stream from Nucor and SDI. That's all flat-rolled steel. Now, I would ask, since you're somebody in the investment field, I guess what I would ask you is, if the steel program is going to make the rich richer, what about the people, what about the companies that are on the margins? Let's say integrated facilities. Integrated facilities like U.S. Steel. There's a real question is exactly how they are going to compete in flat-rolled steel with 9 million new tons of flat-rolled steel by the 3 most efficient producers in the country. It's a very good question. And there's another question, which is whether or not the 232 program has actually accelerated that dynamic by making the rich richer. Because while they were getting richer, U.S. Steel was hanging on. And U.S. Steel is still hanging on, but it raises an interesting question. Pardon me? Well, textile protection isn't the way it was because there isn't much left. But steel, there's a lot of, I get it. In steel, there's a lot of capacity.
Jeff or Ron on this point?
I mean, I guess I would just reiterate a point that Secretary Ross made in his remarks, which is that we're already starting to see positive results from the 232 tariffs, including in the form of increased investment in steel production facilities, new facilities, modernization of existing facilities, and in the form of foreign direct investment, running into the billions of dollars.
Ron Cass.
The argument about how you look at the national security question is one that I've been engaged with since the Reagan administration, when people inside the administration took very different views on what we should be looking at. There were people like Gene Kirkpatrick who really thought that we should be protecting industries that we might need in the case of a war when we would have difficulty getting products from other nations. There were other people in the same administration who said that anything we do now that raises the cost of those products takes money out of what we could otherwise spend on other defense investments. They take money out of what we could use for other parts of our economic support, and that has long-term implications for national security as well. I don't think the two different sides have come any closer over the last 40 years, but I think you raise an issue that is one that will continue to be debated.
I think you have time for a final question.
Hi, this is for Assistant Secretary Kessler, Merrily, International Trade Today. On Auto 232s, the president back in May said he wanted to give 6 months for the parties to discuss ways to deal with the national security threats that the report outlined. We're a month away now, and Europe and the US have not been able to agree on the scope of talks because of the issue of agriculture. Is there a way for the government to offer yet another extension, or are we going to see some kind of action in November?
I believe what the executive order that you're referring to calls for is the U.S. Trade Representative to provide an update to the President 6 months after the issuance of that executive order, so sometime in mid-November. That will be up to the U.S. Trade Representative and the President.
Is there a requirement in the statute that the report be made public once it goes to the President?
Is there a requirement that a report?
Report on the auto report, that it be made public?
I don't have a comment on that.
Okay, thank you.
And eventually it will be.
We've got a few minutes left. Let me give each of you 60 seconds to express a final thought, and then we'll wrap up. We'll go in the order we started. Ron Cass.
Well, the trade issues have been issues of controversy since the beginning of the nation. The first substantive law passed by the first Congress was a Tariff Act, hotly debated, a matter of regional disagreement. Those things will remain matters of disagreement, but I'm glad that the Federalist Society gave us an opportunity to talk about them today, and that Secretary Ross and Assistant Secretary Kessler were willing to be here to both give and take the ammunition on both sides.
Terrific. Don?
Well, thank you for all listening. I found this to be an interesting discussion, and I understand the controversy and the disagreements. But in the end, I do think that that the unilateralism that's been exhibited, I agree that that these are new tools, new policies. That doesn't mean new doesn't necessarily mean good. And new policies aren't necessarily better than old policies. If you want to see what happens to the economy, if they do 232 in autos, just wait, because the largest facility to produce BMWs is in South Carolina. And if you're going to start cutting off and raising the cost of auto parts and automobiles, it is going to have a severe impact on the economy. So let's see. I think that that this latest deal with China, we'll see how it works out, but it appears that there may be some efforts to at least draw things a little bit back in and try to move forward rather than strike out at just one more adversary. Thanks.
Jeff, final thought.
Yeah, I would just thank the Federalist Society for convening this discussion. I think we are in a new era in trade policy, and we're in a new era geopolitically as well. And it's really important for the public, for intellectuals. I suppose that's at least the majority of Federalist Society members to think through how trade policy should adapt to changing circumstances. This administration has taken a new approach, a bolder approach to trade policy problems, and it's in recognition of changing realities, strategic, geopolitical, and economic. And I think that it's important for everyone to understand what tools in the toolbox the United States government has, how we're deploying them, and how we should continue to deploy them to meet the challenges of the future.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in thanking the panelists as well.
Thank you, sir.